Hello and welcome to the second of these review videos in which we cover Unit 2 about belief. In this video, I'm going to talk about, not in huge detail, but connect in some of the textbook notes that we took during this unit. We're going to look at the three class readings, which focused around different issues in religion and looked at Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, which are three of the key religions in world history. And we'll check out the history labs, which focused on the Axial Age and on religious violence. One thing to keep in mind as we talk about this, or as you listen, is that we're covering a huge time period here. We're basically covering the time period between 800 BCE, which marks maybe the starting point of the Axial Age, and the mid 1500s CE. So we're talking over 2,000 years, and that gets us through a ton of religious history, but there's a lot to talk about and a lot to explain. The first thing to look at, and we didn't talk about this a ton in class, so I think it's important to focus on this as a starting point, is to think about categories of belief systems, because belief systems can be compared, and there's some real key similarities between certain categories. The first one, and again, this is a place that we didn't spend much time on when we were working in class, is animism, which is the idea that the whole natural world is inhabited by spirits, so to speak. That there's supernatural stuff of a religious nature that you can worship or make an altar for that exists all around you. So there's a spirit that dwells in that rock, there's a spirit in that tree. There's a rain spirit, that all of these things, all of the ways the natural world work can be explained through these spirits that embody things. And this, if you think about it, in a age before a lot of scientific discovery, this makes a lot of sense. So a lot of old religions are based on these principles. And then they evolve, and a lot evolve into this polytheism, where instead of spirits, maybe you have gods, and the gods have personalities, and they have disagreements, and there are gods that focus on different things like love and war. You can think about the pantheon of Greek gods as being a good example of this. There's a ton of gods in Hinduism that kind of fall into that same category. So polytheistic religions are really common in the ancient world. After about, I would say, about the year 0 or so, once you get Christianity, monotheism becomes the leading way that the world's religions work. And one interesting thing about Christianity is that many religions that were moving in the direction of monotheism, such as Judaism, those religions say, hey, we believe in this one God. This is our God that we worship, but there are also other gods out there that exist. Christianity repudiated the other gods. They said, your gods do not exist. There is one God, it is our God, and that is the only one. And that really changes the tone of things, because it says that in order to be saved, it's not enough for you to believe in what you used to believe, you need to be converted. And one of the things about these monotheistic religions is they were initially somewhat unpopular. For example, the Roman Empire is really famous for feeding the Christians to the lions. And the reason they did that is because Christian beliefs were creating instability in the Roman Empire, because they were forcing people to either change their religious beliefs or be condemned as going to hell. And as you can imagine, that leads to some instability. The other categories that we'll look at are these non-theistic religions, religions whose focus is not on God as much as maybe an exploration of the self. And we'll talk about Buddhism, we'll talk about Taoism as really good examples of that. There's a few others from that Buddhism reading that are kind of pushing back against the idea of a god or many gods. And then some things that we talk about in this unit don't really fall into what we would describe as religion per se, but I would call a philosophy. And so you're exploring religious concepts about what is real, how does the world work, how should people act and be, but you're doing it outside of a spiritual framework. There aren't the kind of religious practices that we're used to, and so we're exploring things in that way. The first reading of this unit is what the Buddha saw. And I picked this reading in part because it focuses in on Buddhism, which again is one of those three really key religious beliefs that spread all over the world. But the other reason I picked it is because it shows the evolution of how new belief systems come into place, because it starts us with a look at Hinduism and what Hinduism provided in ancient Indian society, and then it looks at how, from the beliefs of Hinduism, Buddhism comes about. And there's a couple key ideas in Hinduism. First of all, it's a polytheistic religion. There's a huge group of gods. There's maybe 3 or 4 key gods in that group, but there's a bunch of gods. And then there's the idea of karma, the idea that the way you act in the world gets reflected back at you, and the way karma plays out is through reincarnation. So if your karma is bad, you get reincarnated as something crappy. If your karma is good, you move up the food chain, you get reincarnated as something better. And so the whole world works like this step ladder that you're trying to move up and you're trying not to move down. And so, like all these other religions, we'll talk about this in the next slide, it provides you with a sense of purpose, a sense of goals, and a reward for acting in the correct way. Incidentally, Hinduism also, and probably in many ways that Indian leaders in the ancient world liked, it reinforces the caste system. And the caste system in ancient India basically says that you fall into this social category and you do this sort of job and you marry someone in this caste, and that defines where you are in the society. It's a really highly regimented social stratification. And Hinduism mimics that because it says you move up or you move down based upon what you do in this life. And so in this life, you need to be happy with where you are and you need to do good works because then you can move up. It's not a particularly fair way to organize society, but Hinduism definitely makes that kind of organization more stable. So you can imagine Buddhism then as a way of reimagining or reinventing some of the things that are in Hinduism in a way that's different. And so it takes the idea of karma and it takes the idea of reincarnation and it spins them a different way. And what Buddhism says is that suffering is the main thing, that the goal of existence is to rid oneself of suffering. And the way to rid yourself of suffering is to get rid of your desire, that your desire causes all of your suffering. Your desire right now to get a 5 on the AP test is probably causing you all sorts of suffering. And if you remove that desire, your suffering would also be gone. And so to Buddhism, the idea of being reincarnated forever and ever and ever is almost like a punishment because you keep coming back, and what do you get to come back to do? You get to come back to suffer. And so Buddhism as a religious system is not about gods and it's not about hierarchy, it's about looking inward and it's about finding ways to remove the suffering so that you eventually reach enlightenment or nirvana and you no longer have to suffer in this world. So that's what it is on a personal level. On a political level, Buddhism also acts as a rejection of this caste system because it's not saying, hey, you're moving up or down. It's saying that your religion is personal to you and it's specific to you. Okay, so we're going to move on now and we're going to look at some of these other things that were going on in the same time period. So Buddhism is an example of one of these axial age religions. History Lab number 2 was about looking at a bunch of these axial age traditions at the same time and comparing them and thinking across them. So we read Plato's Allegory of the Cave, we read some of the Taoist texts, the Tao Te Ching, we read from Confucius, we read from the Upanishads, which is one of the Hindu holy texts, we read the first sermon of the Buddha, and we read a chunk of Zoroaster's teaching. Zoroastrianism was the religion that was going on in Persia up until Islam stepped in and basically took over as the religion of choice. One of the key things about this lab is that all of these religions or belief systems or philosophies or whatever you want to call them are primarily concerned with finding out the true nature of reality, with explaining how the universe works. And that the nature of reality in these religions is connected to how we should act. And that, as I said earlier, that there's a goal then based on your correct action. So to give an example of that, the Tao Te Ching basically says that the nature of reality cannot be said. There's no way to really define it or explain it in words, but it exists and it's out there. And to figure it out, you have to think about it, and you have to think about puzzles and paradox and like the weird ways that the world works. And so the Tao Te Ching suggests that the way you do this is by going off and living by yourself in the forest and just thinking about this stuff and meditating about the puzzles and paradoxes in the Tao Te Ching itself. So there's a way in which the nature of reality, which is undescribable, is related to the way that you should work in the world. Plato's allegory of the cave says some similar stuff. He says we're trapped in this cave, we can wander out if we can break free of these chains and we can see what's actually there, but when we come back, people won't believe us because they're so used to seeing the shadows of the cave as the things that are the true nature of reality. And so one of the challenges in that allegory of the cave is how do we convince people, or how do we act in a world where most people are blind to the true nature of reality? So those are a couple examples. There's others. Confucius is really focused on government and virtue and the idea that you listen to your elders and betters who are wise and that you act in the proper way for the goodness of society. We talked about Buddhism on the previous slide. Zoroastrianism is interesting in that it predates some Christian and Islamic ideas about this dualism of good and evil and heaven and hell, and that you do the right thing and you go to heaven, and you do the wrong thing and you go to hell. The final piece of this was we read some secondary sources, and the secondary sources talk about whether or not the term axial age is useful. I tend to think it's somewhat useful here. I think there's some really interesting stuff going on in the world all in the same 400 years or so. A lot of it might have to do with the fact that some of these societies were fragmented and there was a lot of war, there was a lot of death, there was a lot of suffering. And when there's a lot of suffering in the world, people want answers. They want things that can comfort them. They want things that can help explain why the world is the way it is. However, the counterargument to that is that religious tradition didn't just spring up fully formed in 400 years, that there have been all sorts of other religious traditions after the Axial Age. And the question is, why do we just kind of draw the line where it is? Why are Christianity and Islam left out? Why is it this little chunk of time when all sorts of other hugely impactful things about religion happened later on? Okay, so now we move on to the second reading from this unit, Religious and Cultural Conversion to Islam. And the reason I included this is because it lets us look at Islam and Christianity around the Mediterranean, but it also lets us think about the spread of religion, and particularly the spread of what's called portable religions. And portable religions are really different and a new idea in the world, at least around the year 0 or so. The idea is that back in the day in the ancient world, if you had these local spirits that inhabited things or some sort of polytheism, that there were gods that were specific to a place. The gods and the spirits that existed in the supernatural world were related to a place. And so you might have a village set of gods the way now that we have a local sports team. Portable religions are really different because they market themselves. They have monks, they have teachers, they have a holy book, they have places where you can worship, they have a set of practices that are common, where if you were to go to a Buddhist monastery in one place and a Buddhist monastery in the other place, things would look fairly familiar to you. Not identical maybe, but something that you could recognize. And this is really important because these religions obviously spread all over the place like crazy. And the three main ones that did that were Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. They spread out of their original homes and into other places. So Buddhism spread from its origins in India, and it moved into China, it moved into Japan, it moved into Korea, it moved into Southeast Asia. It actually weakened somewhat in India. It became way more important in, say, Japan and Korea, and for a while in China than it was in India at various points in history. Christianity moved from the Middle East, obviously, where it originated, up into Europe with the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire. It became heavily prevalent in Europe. Obviously, we'll get to this later, but when Columbus and the Spanish conquistadors went to the Americas, it suddenly became very important in the Americas. Islam had that same sort of thing. And so this article occurs in the context of this incredibly rapid spread of Islam across the Mediterranean. Basically, Islam unified all of these Arabic tribes in the Middle East. They no longer had each other to raid and steal and take from, and so they needed new things to conquer. And they spread out all across North Africa, up into Spain, and throughout the Middle East, and even into Eastern Europe. So we went from no Islam existing to the Prophet Muhammad to suddenly this vast Islamic caliphate about the year 650, 700 or so. And what this article explains is the way in which people dealt with the fact that suddenly there was this new religious force. And it's important to note that religion has this political component which pushes people to convert. We often think today of this idea of freedom of religion and that you have choice and you choose a religion that best meets your spiritual needs as an individual. And the author of this article, Jessica Coop, mentions that, but she also talks about how religion was a really political choice and it was a way of belonging in a society and it was a way of being a member of the society in a different way. And in this article, she mentions various things that the society did that placed followers of Islam above followers of Christianity. And she focuses on Spain to do this. And she talks about what some of the reasons were for someone to convert. There were differences in the tax code. If you were Christian, you couldn't be the boss of people who were Muslim. There were all sorts of different things that privileged people in society based upon their political beliefs. She also gets at this really interesting idea about how when you have two religions that are similar enough, and Christianity and Islam are certainly not identical, but they follow some of the same teachings, some of the same holy books, and it can be challenging to define what makes someone a member of one or the other, that people could pass, in a sense, as Muslim in their public life, but in their private life, they could have another set of beliefs. So there's this really interesting set of ambiguities to how religious conversion works. To continue with the theme of politics and religion, the third history lab talks about religious violence. And we looked at Pope Urban's speech, urging people to go fight in the Crusades. We looked at a Muslim source about the Crusades from Ibn al-Athir, who will pop up again in a later history lab. We looked at the Quran and what it says about violence. We looked at the Bible and what it says. We looked at St. Augustine, who's a very important Christian scholar. And one of the things that this lab does is it allows us to take Christian beliefs and trace them from the time of Jesus to the time of the Crusades. And the Crusades are basically the Pope's attempt at first, this is at least kind of the rationale for the First Crusade. The Pope is saying, we have all these Christians fighting each other in Europe. Can we please get together and fight someone else instead, right? It's not holy or sacred or good to be fighting other Christians. But hey, guess what, guys? There's this holy land, and we don't control it, and these infidels control it, and we need to go take it back from them. And it gave a sense of common purpose, right? We talked about nationalism much later in the year. Religion serves some of the same purpose as nationalism. It unites people behind a set of ideas. So when we look at the Bible, Jesus says very clearly that you can't do stuff like this. You can't hurt other people in the name of God. Like, that's not how it works. By the time we get to St. Augustine a few hundred years later in the Roman Empire has adopted Christianity. And so suddenly there is a political component to the religion. The religion is used for political ends. And if you're an empire, you can't simply turn the other cheek, which is what Jesus would tell you to do. If someone steals from you, you can't just give them more stuff. You have to punish them. You're an empire. You're maintaining order. And so St. Augustine defines this idea of a just war and what a just war would be and how you shouldn't be happy about it, but you can do it. And this gets kind of corrupted by the time of the Crusades. So instead of it being a defensive war, the Crusades are an offensive war, I would argue. One of the things that I picked up when I looked back through the secondary sources is how they really focus on how Christianity and Islam have been in conflict for a really long time. And part of that is due to the nature of them being so close in some ways ideologically, but yet different. And part of that has to do with the fact that they both originated in the same general place in the world around the Mediterranean, and they're both fighting for the same followers. They're fighting fights to get the same sort of group of people on their side. Okay, that gets us to the last article from this unit. The first article about Buddhism is way back, say around 600 BCE. The second article took place in the 900s, I believe, in Spain, but CE, so about 1500 years later. This one takes place another 600 years later or so, and it looks at the ways in which religions split and change and develop over time. And the word for a religious split or any sort of split is a schism. And religious schisms are really common because people don't agree on religious orthodoxy. As these portable religions grow and spread, suddenly there's thousands and millions of followers, and there's different people with different interpretations of the holy writings. So, a really good example of this would be at the fall of the Roman Empire, how the western half of the Roman Empire splits into a bunch of small feudal states and follows the Pope and follows the Catholic Church, while the eastern half follows what's called sort of the Orthodox Church and interprets Christianity in a different way. Another really good example of this, there are some splits in Buddhism. There's also a really important split right at the beginning of Islam, where after Muhammad's death, there were two groups of followers who had different beliefs about who should assume the mantle, who should be the leader of the religion, because Muhammad hadn't made any description of who it should be. And so these schisms have created branches of religions. The Muslim one that I just described, you end up with a group called Sunni Muslims, and then you have a group of Shia Muslims, and this becomes important later on. In Christianity, a really key schism happens in Western Europe with the Catholic Church and these Protestant reformers. And this article traces how we get there. And it basically argues that before the Protestant Reformation and before literacy was a big thing, the Pope's word was God's word. He brings up this analogy of a meter stick, and he says that just how we rely on the meter stick to tell us what is accurate about measurement, people relied on the word of the Pope to say what was accurate about God's will for the world. And that was their way of knowing how to be good Christians. And to question the Pope's word would be just as crazy as to question whether the meter stick used for international measurement is incorrect. And what changes all of this is literacy. And literacy starts to bubble up with the invention of the printing press. It takes place in the 13, 14, 1500s with the Renaissance in Europe, with this influx of science and art. And it means that people are now reading the holy texts and they're interpreting them in different ways. And so the printing press is obviously very valuable, but it can be really destabilizing again for societies because there isn't just one person who keeps the knowledge. Now everyone has access to the knowledge. A comparison can be made with the internet, right? And with the way news media works today. It's not just 3 news media stations. Suddenly anyone can read anything on the internet and make up their mind, for good or bad. So this upheaval can be split into the Renaissance, which isn't really a time of fighting at all, a time of kind of regrowth and rebirth and looking back to these classical ideas, classical Greece, classical Rome. The Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther nails a bunch of complaints to the door and says, like, here's all the problems with the Catholic Church, and I'm splitting off, and I'm going to go marry a nun. And then after that, you get people picking sides. They say, hey, our country in Western Europe is going to be Protestant. Our country is still Catholic. And you get these massive religious wars in Europe, which are super costly, but also really useful for Europe in terms of developing military technology. Again, a subject for Unit 6, I think. Okay, so that gets us through the bulk of the stuff in this unit. Some big concepts and some also examples based on these religions. So here's a sample AP question for you. This is from an older AP test, and it says, analyze how political transformations contributed to continuities and changes in the cultures of the Mediterranean region during the period 200 CE to 1000 CE. So before you freak out about this, let's just figure out what it's asking. It's asking about the relationship of politics, and it's asking about the relationship of that to culture. And culture is often on the AP test just a buzzword that means religion. And it wants us to think of continuities and changes. So at least one thing that stayed the same over that time period around the Mediterranean and one thing that changed. So I would recommend pausing this video at this point, taking a few minutes to work on this, make a list of changes, a list of continuities, and then I'm going to move ahead and go over some possible answers to this question. So I'm assuming that at this point you have thought about this question a little bit. I made a list of ways to think about it. So this time period 200 to 1000 hits two really important things, at least in terms of religion. The most important is the origins of Islam, is the fact that there was no Islamic faith at all in 200 CE, but by 1000 CE, there was Islam everywhere in the Mediterranean region. So that's hugely important. The other big change that happens really early in this time period, so you might be able to use it in some different ways, is that the Roman Empire adopts Christianity. And so then Europe becomes Christian, and then the Roman Empire falls apart. And so the power center moves from southern Europe and the Roman Empire to the Middle East in the heart of the Islamic caliphates. In terms of continuities, changes are often going to be specific. Continuities are going to be bigger, more general themes. So one theme I would point out is that these are both monotheistic belief systems that are dominating the region, and that the empires use those religions to maintain power. This doesn't quite get us to the Crusades, so we can't quite use that as an example for this stuff, but they're still governing with this religious authority in mind. Here's my sample thesis. Throughout the majority of the time period, 200 to 1000 CE, empires used monotheistic religions to maintain power. And our evidence for that would be the use of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the use of Islam in the caliphates in the Middle East. However, there were changes in the role of Christianity as the power of the Christian church weakened due to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Islamic caliphates. And so I think it's important to get at that distinction, that we go from having one big monotheistic religion that is important to suddenly there's two and there's competition, and the Christian church actually becomes fairly weak in this time period, and the Islamic caliphates are really running the show. That's where culture is going on and art. That's where empire is being built. So that's a big part of it. If you're looking for any other questions that might be good to review, I recommend you go back to Unit 6 on the website. There is a link to some practice stuff, and at the semester we looked at a question about thinking about whether Buddhism was a turning point in world history, whether Islam was a turning point in world history, and those would be good to look back at as well if you're trying to find more review information.